Okay, let's start. So this is the last PowerPoint for this section, and we're covering chapters 13 and 14, and we're covering evolution and speciation. More specifically, the mechanism. The mechanism is the main thing that I want to emphasize here. So way back in the day, Aristotle was a known philosopher who did believe in fixed species. So he didn't think that species evolved over time or populations evolved over time. He thought the Earth was about 6,000 years old, and he did begin to classify organisms using a scale called the Scala Natura. So it's like a ladder of organisms from simple to complex. So things at the bottom would be things like plants, and things near the top would be things, or like in the middle would be things like rodents, and then things closer to the top would be like primates or humans. So Scala Natura, that's his main thing. That's his main contribution. Now we had Buffon, who came much later. He supposed that Earth was probably a little bit more than 6,000 years old, and that fossils may be ancient versions of living organisms. So things that lived way back in the day died and were preserved. And he also thought that species may change over time, though he did not suggest a mechanism for it. And then we had Lamarck, which came a little bit after that. He was actually a student of Buffon, and he tried to suggest a mechanism for evolution. So his idea was this concept of inheritance of acquired characteristics. So he thought that with continued use, some structures would become larger from generation to generation to generation, whereas others become smaller from disuse. So his example was giraffe necks. So he thought that giraffes have long necks because they use their necks a lot. And so over time, if you use your neck a lot, it'll get bigger. So over time, if you use the thing a lot, it'll get bigger, if only. All right, so Lamarck's giraffes. So this is his example. So his ancestors, the ancestors of giraffes, would have short necks. Now, because branches might be high sometimes and food is hard to reach sometimes, it would be beneficial to have a larger neck. And so if they stretched their neck from use, over time, the long neck was just passed on. So it should, at this point in 2021, sound a little bit suspect, right? Like you use it a lot, therefore it gets bigger. Not really a great proposed mechanism. So in the 1800s, we thought, as a collective species, we thought maybe there's a better explanation for things. So there was a problem with Lamarck's ideas. There was an experiment that was run where they would cut off mice tails. So they would take mice, cut off their tails, have them mate, and if they're not using their tails, or if they don't have tails, they're not using their tails, right? And so based off of Lamarck's ideas, their offspring should not have tails. However, their offspring did have tails. So in a sense, it disproved his theory. Simultaneous to this, more fossils were being found. Mary Anning was studying dinosaur fossils. Charles Lyell, he was studying plate tectonics, and he, proposed that Earth is always changing, always reactive. It's always changing. And then we had Thomas Malthus, who proposed that overpopulation leads to demand for resources and the struggle for existence. So supply and demand. Overpopulation would lead to, if you have too many of one type of organism that all use the same resources, that means that those resources that they consume, that they use, would probably be lower in supply. Therefore, there'd be a higher demand for it. So there's competition. And then we also had, in the 1800s, Alfred Russel Wallace and Charles Darwin, who were kind of the pioneers of the idea of, or pioneers of finding a mechanism for evolution. So Wallace was considered to be the father of zoography. He studied animals, and he had this idea of protective resemblance, or he came up with the terminology for protective resemblance. And so in this case, you have the Mexican milk snake, which is not a venomous creature, but we also have the Texas coral snake, which is very venomous. And both of these snakes exist, completely different species. They don't mate with each other. However, they're identified as trouble by potential predators. Therefore, the Mexican milk snakes don't even have to spend energy or time being venomous, yet they still get the benefits of being feared by potential predators. Wallace also suggested the phrase "survival of the fittest" to Darwin to try to explain natural selection. Okay, we have a few. Some of them have huge mouths. That's a good one. All right, so Charles Darwin. So he was an unpaid. He took a 5-year voyage, unpaid. Isn't it nice? 5-year unpaid voyage across the world. So his father was a physician, and his mother was a Wedgwood, which supposedly they had a lot of money back then. So he was able to afford it. He was full ride scholarship to do whatever he wanted on an expedition to view the world. He was also smart too, so I guess he deserves it, maybe, I don't know. So he returned from the voyage after 5 years, and for 26 years after that. So this is where the time was spent. 26 years after he came back, that's where he compiled the data, considered the alternatives, and he also had a lot of pressure from the church at the time. So he was kind of afraid to publish anything suggesting evolution because the church would have not accepted anything he would publish. He also received a manuscript from Wallace to review, and this is where it gets a little bit hairy, a little bit drama. But shortly after he received Wallace's paper to review, that's when he ended up publishing. So I had an idea of natural selection, wrote it on the manuscript. Both papers were reviewed, so both Wallace's paper and Darwin's papers were reviewed, and then Darwin published his book in 1859. We don't have to remember exact dates, but do know that the title of his book was The Origin of Species by Natural Selection. So that's the main takeaway from this slide. So here are the tenets of his book. So individuals in a population vary. So like me and you and everyone here, we all vary. We have all kinds of variation. And maybe using us as a population is a bad example for evolution. We could take, gerbils or bacteria. You have a petri dish of bacteria. There's going to be a little bit of variance between each of those bacteria. Variations, so the variations that those bacteria would contain would pass off to their offspring. So every time they divide, those traits that they have, those variations, passed on to their offspring. And so there's a genetic component here. Those traits are kind of, they emerge from the genetic difference, right? And so the variations, that your genetics are passed down to your offspring, therefore your variations are passed down to your offspring. And then the third tenet was more offspring are produced than the environment can support. So there is some element of competition. So within that petri dish, they're all struggling to gather the same resource, all right? And the ones that are able to gather more resource will maybe have more energy, maybe more energy to reproduce. So the fourth tenet is survival is not random, but it depends on how fit to the environment one is. So by fit, we don't necessarily mean, fitness. The bacteria aren't, bench pressing and, running triathlons or anything. They're fit to the environment in the sense that they're able to gather more resources and reproduce more successfully. So that's what fitness is, at least in biological terms. Then the fifth tenet is individuals with characteristics that make them best suited to the environment live and reproduce to have more offspring. So, okay, yeah, and then the sixth tenet would be populations will change over time. So we could use a different analogy. We don't have to use bacteria. We could use I don't know, lizards, for example. You know, you have a bunch of lizards and their population will vary. So you're going to have big lizards, you're going to have small lizards, you're going to have medium-sized lizards, and their population varies. Their colors are going to vary. Their, you know, every appendage is going to be different. On, you know, like there's so many qualities to a population that you can't take all of them into account. But let's say size is what we're going to be focusing on. So you have a population of lizards, all different sizes. More offspring are produced than the environment can support. So you have, you know, these lizards proliferate pretty readily. There's only limited supplies of food, and let's say they eat worms or insects. So survival is not random, but depends on how fit to the environment one is. So let's say that, you know, the smaller ones, there's competition. So lizards are going to beat up other lizards, maybe. Maybe this is just an aggressive species of lizard, and maybe the lizards may eat friendly lizards, who knows? But you have big ones, you have medium-sized ones, you have small ones. So individuals with characteristics that make them best suited to their environment live and reproduce and have more offspring. So let's say that the bigger ones are able to better, feed. They're able to better catch their prey. And if they find competitors, other competing lizards, they'll just eat the other lizards. They'll just kill the other lizards. So in this case, over time, we have, you know, those lizards have, kind of like us, you know, we have many genes contributing to our height or to our size. While these lizards that are larger have genes that contribute to it. And those larger lizards are able to get food more successfully, and they're able to ward off other lizards of even the same species. And so as a result, they have more energy because they have more food. They've eliminated some of the population pool by simply eating the smaller lizards, and they're opening up, like by eating competition. We'll just talk about the male lizards. The males are eating the other male lizards, for example. Now they're able to reproduce with the female lizards, and because they are the survivors, therefore their genes will be passed on to more offspring, because they are the lizards that are surviving and proliferating the most successfully. So they are the most fit for their environment. And so over time, that population of lizards will change in a direction of size. So that means that, you know, over time, you'll have larger lizards. So here's Darwin, you know, this is comparing Lamarck's ideas to Darwin's ideas. So ancestors, we have variation in the population. So we have giraffes, the early giraffes. Some have small necks, some have medium necks, some have long necks, all right? Small necks are not able to access food. Maybe, you know, like let's say, depending on the change of seasons, you know, some food may not be available in the lower elevation of the tree. And, or let's just say, you know, actually we could just keep it static. The short necks are only able to get so much food, right? So like they can eat what's available to them, you know, at the height that they can reach. But the long neck giraffes are able to eat up high, in the middle, and down low. So short necks have a scarcer supply of food. So therefore, maybe some of them might starve to death. So if they starve to death and they die, they don't get to reproduce. And so what's left alive are giraffes with longer, maybe medium or longer necks, for example. And so that process there is natural selection. And the long necks reproduce and pass their trait to the next generation. So the genes that contribute to the length of the neck are able to be passed on to the offspring by the giraffes with longer necks. And so over time, giraffes have longer necks as a population. So that would be evolution. Natural selection would be that selection event. You know, no survival, no food, which is no survival, which is no reproduction. So descent with modification is the term that was used. The individual descendants pass on their modifications, so the populations will change over time. So individuals don't evolve. So within one lifespan, you know, you're not going to have a giraffe that was born with a small neck and then eventually gets a large neck. This is a matter of the population changing over time. And so that's what I'm trying to emphasize here is you're looking at the average population. You're not looking at any individuals. Individuals are not going to evolve. Okay, so natural selection, by definition, is the organism that has the adaptations for it to successfully reproduce will pass on those adaptations to its offspring. And so if you remember the peppered moth story, did we talk about the peppered moth story? I think we did. No, we did not. We didn't? Okay, well anyways, peppered moth story. I'll give you the peppered moth story. So peppered moths are these moths, they're peppered, that means they have speckles of different colors. So we have some light moths with dark speckles, and we have some dark moths with light speckles. And so they like to live on these aspen trees. So there are these trees with very lightly colored bark. Now we know moths, their main predator is going to be birds or just larger mammals, or yeah, we'll just say birds. Birds love to eat moths. So early in England, before the Industrial Revolution, you have both of these moth variants living on aspen trees, and the darker ones are actually a little bit easier to spot because, well, they're dark, and even though they have light speckles, they're not camouflaged perfectly, and so birds were able to eat those a lot easier. And so the ones with those traits, the ones with the darker ones with the genes that contribute to that, you know, they wouldn't be able to reproduce as readily as the lighter ones because, well, they're getting eaten. Then the Industrial Revolution happened, and we got all this soot buildup on the aspen trees, darkened the bark, so it soaked into the bark. And so now what happens is the darker moths were better able to camouflage than the lighter moths. And so what you'll see here is a shift in the population. Overall, the moths that would predominate the population would be the darker moths, the ones carrying the genes that contribute to darker color. And so here, this is it right here. So peppered moths have two different forms: white with dark spots, dark with white spots. Lived among aspen trees, white with dark spots. And the birds were the main predators for these moths. Pre-industrial revolution, moths with white moths with dark spots were abundant. And then post-industrial revolution, you got the soot on the trees, and then moths with the dark moths with white spots became abundant. So nature selects population characteristics, not individuals. So here's another example, MRSA, the way we would develop MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. So before any kind of selection event, you know, you have variation of this species, Staphylococcus aureus, okay? And so we could say that the color shows the level of resistance to antibiotic. Okay, so yellow ones have low resistance, and the red ones on the spectrum have the highest resistance level. So we take methicillin, which is just an antibiotic to combat a staph infection, and this is what we talked about in chapter 1. So this was the example. We didn't go into as much detail, but we talked about antibiotic resistance. So you take methicillin to combat a staph infection, and what happens is the bacteria with antibiotic resistance are able to survive. So there's a selection event, and it says directly after selection. So what happens, we could even just say this is a topical thing. We smear a bunch of antibiotic, you know, on someone's leg, for example, and it's going to kill off all of the bacteria that have no resistance. And the ones that have resistance are able to survive. And so the only ones that survive are the only ones that are going to be able to replicate. And so as a result, the population, even after this one event, you've selected for only bacteria that are resistant to bacteria. So all of the ones that survive pass on their genetic traits or their genes that contribute to antibiotic resistance. And so yeah, the remaining population are all resistant to the antibiotic. So that's how we could, you know, just in one generation create, you know, superbugs, for example. So we have different ways that natural selection can move. What we've talked about so far the most is directional selection. This is where you're moving from one average to another average. You go from light moth dominated population to dark moth dominated population. You go from just a generic medium antibiotic resistant bacteria in one direction. You move in one direction towards one extreme, which is antibiotic resistant bacteria. And then in the case of the lizards, the larger lizards, you go from a great distribution or a medium distribution to larger lizards. So in this case, or in all three of those cases, that was directional selection. So we would call that directional selection. So you're selecting for one extreme trait and you're selecting against the other extreme. So this is an example of lizards, and we're talking about their tail length. So let's say, short tails on lizards might help them stabilize when running around, might help them with their movement. However, the longer the tail gets, the more like a snake it looks. And we know that, some predators will avoid snakes, but grab other stuff. Snakes are usually associated with, poisonousness. So it's beneficial for the lizards to have longer tails. So over time, the predators would probably, eat these lizards and more readily eat the ones with shorter tails because they're the least harmful looking. And they would less often eat the lizards with the longer tails because they're more harmful looking. And so as a result, the long wiggly tail looks like a snake to scare predators. The longer tail, the more it looks like a snake. And so over time, you get a shift from an even distribution of short, medium, and long tails, a nice bell curve, to a population that is predominated by longer-tailed snakes, or longer-tailed lizards. Next, we have a stabilizing selection. So in this case, what we're doing is we're selecting against both extremes. So in this case, we're selecting against short tails. Short tails make them look less harmful. Long tails make them look more harmful, therefore do not eat them. In this case, we have cats, some kind of cats. So yeah, cats balance. So tails help with the movement of cats. So their tails, if you've ever seen a cheetah run, it actually shifts its tail back and forth with its movement, and it uses it to balance and to run at the speed that it runs at. So its tail is actually very important. So in this case, let's say, cats are typically predators, and so they need to run fast and efficiently to catch their prey. Now, short tails probably wouldn't provide as much balance. However, long, if the tails were too long, it'd probably catch on brush or, catch onto things and maybe slow them down even, maybe less aerodynamic. So over time, the cats with the longer tails are less successful when they go to do their predatorial stuff, and the cats with short tails are less successful because they can't catch their prey because, their tail messes up their balance. And what happens is that the cats with medium-sized tails, so the trait in the middle, or the characteristic, the moderate characteristic, are best able to hunt their prey. Therefore, they're more successful. Therefore, they don't starve to death. Therefore, over time, the population will select for the medium trait. We call this a stabilizing selection. So this kind of makes sense in terms, or I guess, in terms of the term itself, stabilizing. You're removing the outskirts and you're selecting for what's in between, the middleman. Directional selection, you're moving in one direction. Now here we have a very interesting one. We've got disruptive selection. And so if you guys have seen chipmunks, you've probably seen squirrels. Chipmunks have little tiny tails and squirrels have very long tails. Well, evolution suggests that they probably came from a common ancestor. And this is just off the cuff, well, not off the cuff, but this is a something to think about regarding chipmunks and squirrels. So disruptive selection selects for both extremes and it selects against the middle. And so in this case, short tails will help keep predators from catching you on the ground. So let's say, on the ground, if you don't have as many appendages sticking out or as large of appendages, you're harder to catch by predators. So if you don't have a large tail, there's less stuff for them to grab, and so you're able to jolt in between trees and outrun your predators. However, if you have a long tail, it's good for balance up in trees, so you can hide from predators up on top of trees, like within the trees, and so you could just evade everything altogether. But if you have a medium-sized tail, well, maybe it's too large or it's so large that it's something to catch, yet it's not large enough that you can balance in trees very well with the large tail. And so what happens is, over time, those early ancestors of chipmunks and squirrels are eaten. The ones with the medium tails are eaten more frequently than the ones with short tails and the ones with long tails. And so over time, you might get a speciation event. But in this case, we call this disruptive selection. So the way this moves is you select against both extremes. So it's disruptive. You're karate chopping down the middle. You're removing the middle, the medium characteristic, and you're disrupting that bell curve by selecting for the extremes. So directional selection moves in one direction. Stabilizing selection, you are stabilizing by selecting for the medium characteristic, and then disruptive selection, you are disrupting the bell curve by selecting for, you're creating two bell curves in a sense, or you're creating two peaks in the population. And then, in addition to all this, we have sexual selection. So this is something that's not even, it's occurring simultaneous to natural selection, but it's not selecting for what traits are most favorable for survival. Because if you look at peacocks, especially like the male peacocks, the females really like males with the broad patterns and the large spectacle. But imagine running away from some prey in this form. You're not going to be able to get away very fast. However, the desire of females to mate with males with such characteristics overrides the natural selection. And so here's a funny movie that I would normally show a snippet of in class. It's called Idiocracy. It's just kind of like a comedic take on that, where we're applying sexual selection to humans and how sexual selection is actually kind of ruining our evolution. Okay, so let's define a species. So species is a group of interbreeding organisms with similar characteristics that produce offspring that can reproduce. So a species is something that can mate with those of the same species. So mate with same species and produce offspring that can also reproduce. So if you've ever heard of a liger, which is a combination of a tiger and a lion, they could actually make, tigers and lions can reproduce and make offspring, which is a liger, but that liger is actually infertile, so not able to reproduce. So therefore, it maintains tigers and lions as separate species because the intermediate, their offspring, cannot reproduce. And so here's some more things that could be reproductive barriers. So temporal, like if you mate during a certain time of year, well, other things may mate during other times of year. So that's just another barrier. Geographic isolation, if you simply are not near the other organism in order to reproduce. Behavioral, so maybe you're just not even attracted to the way that bird does its call or whatever. Mechanical, so if the parts don't fit. And then gametic, so gametes are not compatible, which is probably like the hardest and fastest rule. Gametes aren't compatible. Maybe too many chromosomes in one, maybe too little in the other. They just cannot mesh well. Okay, so let's talk about mechanisms of speciation. So this is the generation of new species. So when you get geographical isolation or geographic isolation, which leads to speciation, we call that allopatric speciation, not geographic speciation. So geographic isolation leads to allopatric speciation. So an example of this, let's say you have chipmunks that are chilling in some area, all right? And over time, you get tectonic shifts, which, creates this crater in between, right smack in the middle of this area. And now you have a river flowing or a creek flowing through it, but chipmunks can't necessarily swim. And so what you've done, let's say, those chipmunks lived, in a bubble around that area, and we've karate chopped that population in half. Well, now you have two separate environments. You're not able to cross mate with each other. And so even though they're technically, they could even be in the same biome, in the same environment, there's still micro differences to the environment. So maybe simultaneously, you also split a different species down the middle, or you isolated one species to one side that can't cross to the other. And so now you've got maybe a little bit of different food source and maybe a little bit of different predation. And so over time, these are going to mate with just themselves. These are just going to mate with themselves. And over time, over a really long time, they're no longer going to be able to mate with each other. Therefore, they're no longer the same species. Therefore, a speciation event occurred. And we call that allopatric speciation. And that's a result of geographic isolation. So the same thing kind of, you can consider the same thing, like armadillos, anteaters, they've got common ancestors, or they have a common ancestor. And so over time, if you get geographic isolation and you're isolated to just mating with one type in a specific environment, you're going to evolve in accordance with that specific environment. And at some point, you're no longer going to be able to mate with your common ancestor or with those, in a different location. So this is just another example of that. And then we have another type of speciation, which we've talked about when we went over genetics, where we get polyploids. So a lot of our fruits that we eat are actually polyploids. This is a result of sympatric speciation. So reproductive isolation, so there's no geographic isolation necessary. So reproductive isolation, not because of geography. So the geography doesn't play a role. And this most commonly happens in plants. So we know that, let's say a three chromosome organism, its haploid, or 3 chromosome numbered organism, its haploid would have 3 chromosomes total. And then let's just say its normal genotype would be diploid. And so, 1 from mom, 1 from dad for chromosome 1, and then 1 from mom, 1 from dad for chromosome 2, 1 from mom, 1 from dad for chromosome 3. But in plants, sometimes you get that failure to separate your chromosomes during an anaphase, and as a result, some of your cells or some of your gametes even might have more chromosomes than normal, and when that merges with, a regular gamete, you might end up with a triploid individual or a tetraploid individual. But in plants, it doesn't necessarily kill the plant. And in fact, one common thing that we've found is that it just makes them larger, but they're not necessarily harmful. And so we've actually found it's nice to selectively breed for these polyploids and just, sell the polyploids because, well, people like big strawberries more than small strawberries, right? They associate that with, okay, these plants are healthier or whatever. But in fact, they're actually like tetraploids. So they're just mutants of the original species. So sympatric speciation this can occur, the turnover could be 1 generation, and then you just mate those polyploids with each other to, and this could happen in nature too. So, and then this link is a pretty cool one talking about polyploids. If you just click on the hyperlink. Okay, so now we could talk about evidence for common ancestry. So things that would point in the direction of things having common ancestors. So we have comparative anatomy, which is one way we can point in the direction of organisms having common ancestry. So homologous structures will provide evidence for common ancestry. And so in this case, you've got a bird with a humerus, ulna, radius, and we could say early humerus, ulna, radius, metacarpals, phalanges, or variants of them. And then you look at a bat, you look at a whale, a cat, a horse, and a human, and this would imply at some point way back in the day, we shared a common ancestor because we have similar structured organs, or you could say appendages. So through random mutations and natural selection, each organism's anatomical structure is gradually adapted to suit their respective habitats. So, for example, you have a whale, and it's got super long phalanges and a super short humerus. This might not be very conducive for flying, for example, but it is very conducive for swimming. And you could think of that, even geographic isolation. If you're in a more aquatic environment, where you're going to select for characteristics that benefit swimming, and bats and birds, that's actually an example of convergent evolution. They have similar common ancestors, or they have the same common ancestor, but they discovered flight on their own, if you will. Through birds, it was beneficial to be able to take flight, and same with bats, but they didn't come from a common ancestor that flew, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Okay, and then we also have comparative embryology. So in general, the embryos of organisms that have closer genetic relationship to one another will tend to look similar for a longer period of time, since they share more common ancestors. So, for example, you have fish and salamanders, which are very closely related, and closely related in the phylogenetic tree, and they also tend to look similar for a longer period through their embryonic development. Turtles look a little bit less like them, but humans definitely do not look like them. Like, we might all look similar, at the get-go, but there's major divergence pretty early on. And so that would imply that we are further genetically, or further away from fish and salamanders than we are from turtles, for example. Now we also have vestigial structures. So this is actually a snake. So we know of snakes being these organisms that lack feet, but they did emerge. They came from creatures that did have feet. And as a result, they have the remnants of it, and we call these vestigial structures. Whales have hip bones. So these are just things that are not necessarily used and may even detract from one's fitness. So in terms of snakes, a story that I like to use for snakes is, let's say you're a lizard that lives in a really rocky environment, and your main predators are birds, or even your main predators could be rodents, for example. And so you're a lizard that lives in this rocky environment, and you're not necessarily competing much for food, but you really want to avoid predation. And large feet or large legs may prevent you from getting into the nooks and crannies of the rocks. And so your brothers and sister, within your population, all of your brothers and sisters will have varying lengths of legs in the early, pre-snake era. And, the ones with the smallest legs were able to hide a lot better from birds or from rodents from eating you. And the ones with the largest legs weren't able to fit as deep into the rocks as the other lizards. And so therefore they were eaten. And over time, maybe with each generation, there was a selective pressure to have smaller and smaller legs. And as a result, at the end of the day, the most fit of that species had the absence of legs. And so they, at the end of the day, they just have these limbs. Now, it might come into question, why why do they still have these nubs? So the reason for that is that you could get rid of the length of legs, for example, but you might still have remnants of the characteristics. So, you know, like you have these nubs. To completely remove it would probably interfere with one's natural developmental pattern. And so if you were to change their developmental pattern, you would probably see numerous side effects, negative side effects, as a result of removing, you know, completely any trace of legs, for example. So even like horses, we kind of identify them as these single-toed creatures, but early horses had multiple toes, which is kind of interesting. Another piece of evidence for common ancestry is, this is probably the most straightforward, is molecular biology. So those with very similar genetic composition will be considered to be, you know, closely related evolutionarily. Whereas if you're very divergent, then you are going to be less closely related. And then we have fossil record. And so here's the example of horses that I mentioned. So they had multiple toes early on, and then the new and improved horses will have single toes, or what we consider to be, you know, single toes. So fossils are an important evidence for evolution because they show that life on Earth was different than life at some point was different than life that we have today. And it just shows it would show the evolutionary progression of a single species, for example. And so we could actually take genetic samples from each of them and show not only the physiological changes, but also the genetic changes over time, just from taking, you know, just from looking at the gradual progression of the fossils, or different samples from each fossil. And then some paleontologists will determine the age of fossils using methods like radiometric dating, and then categorize them to determine the evolutionary relationships between them. Okay, so systematics, that's just going to be the study of diversity on life and the evolutionary relationships between organisms. Taxonomy, so that's just going to be the naming, identifying, and classifying organisms, usually based off of shared traits. So like, for example, Homo sapiens, the term homo comes from the study of the language to classify things. Sapiens is a term derived from the study of terminology or taxonomy. And then we have phylogeny. So you can think of the phylogenetic tree. That's just going to be the evolutionary history of a group of organisms. So Linnaeus is the father of taxonomy, and he grouped organisms based off of shared traits, not necessarily implying heredity. And he also more clearly defined genus and species. So here was, you know, a piece of his manuscript. And so here's an important thing that we are going to need to know, the hierarchy of classification. So we start off with domain, then we go to kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. The two things that we're going to need to know are genus and species. I'm not going to test you on this exact order, though it is going to be very helpful to know for any of your future bio classes. The trick that I've used is, do kids prefer candy over fresh green salad? So domain is going to be the largest umbrella. So we're part of eukarya, for example, or cats are a part of eukarya, which just means that they have a nucleus. And then the kingdom, animalia. So animals, cats are a type of animal. Phylum is chordata, so they're chordates. And then their class is mammalia, so they're mammals. Their order is carnivora, carnivores. Family, Felidae. And then their genus is Felis. and their species is Catus. And so the way we use these, or when we describe something using binomial nomenclature, binomial, so bi meaning two, nomial meaning name, so two name naming nomenclature, so two name naming, your Felis Catus, both of these will either be underlined or italicized. Your genus is always going to be capitalized, and your species is always going to be lowercase. So Felis Catus would just be, you know, both of these are underlined. Felis is capitalized, Catus is lowercase. Okay, so binomial nomenclature, two name naming system that we use. So genus is capitalized and underlined or italic, and species is lowercase, underlined, and italic. And so we have Felis Catus, and then we also have Homo, which means great apes, and sapiens, meaning wise. So we have Homo sapiens for us.